This is Scott Cluthe in the Phonoscope studios in Houston, Texas. Money for Nothing Inside the Federal Reserve is the compelling title of the recently released independent film that my guest today, Jim Bruce, producer and director and so much more, is screening across the U.S. and in movie theaters, public gatherings, and more. It examines the inner workings of one of our most misunderstood and also, in many cases, most mistrusted federal agencies. With an all-star cast of technical and creative support, including the voice of Liev Schreiber, well known as the lead for the HBO series Ray Donovan, and many more, Jim Bruce has shed light on the Federal Reserve with interviews featuring top economists and current and former Federal Reserve officers, including the newly sworn-in head, Janet Yellen, the first woman to chair the Fed. Jim, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Just the circumstances of developing funding to get this film made is a great backstory. As your own financial education and practices created a perfect storm that also was part of a financial storm for the entire country, starting with the collapse of the housing market. Tell us about that time back in 2007, 2008, and clues and facts that concerned you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting part of how I came about doing this story, is that I was someone who, with the help of some of the people in the film, some of the economists and newsletter writers who were predicting the crisis years in advance, I was looking at the housing bubble forming, in the early to mid 2000s, seeing it as a problem, and in 2007 and 8, I very aggressively shorted financial stocks and basically made enough money to fund a considerable portion of the film's budget out of my own pocket. At the time, what I was worried about was the entire U.S. financial system was levered to the housing market. Housing was in a bubble, and basically as soon as housing prices rolled over, the Fed thought it would just be a problem for the real estate market, but no, it was a problem that could have taken down every bank in the world, actually. And so I was shorting those bank stocks and profiting from the fall in stocks. But then in the wake of the crisis, I felt like, we better address what led to that problem in the first place.
Well, Jim Grant, an economist filmed in Money for Nothing, says that the U.S. dollar has nothing behind it. What's he referring to?
I mean, that's the crazy part. A lot of people are surprised when they learn it for the first time that there really is nothing backing the U.S. dollar. And in older times, currencies, the U.S. dollar was backed by gold until 1971, when Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. And really, there's nothing behind the U.S. dollar but the faith that people have that the government, and in particular the Federal Reserve, which manages the money supply in the U.S., won't create too many of them. But what we've seen over the Fed's history is sort of precisely that, the Fed creating more dollars and more dollars each year, and the dollar steadily losing its value. Historically, when the currency was tied to gold, that actually didn't happen. Currencies on gold tended to maintain their value over time.
He also said the dollar is the Coca-Cola of money. What does he mean by that, Jim?
Well, I think he's describing that the dollar is sort of a brand. I mean, you hear it's in rap songs, it's in movies. Everyone, people are trying to get a suitcase full of $100 bills on game shows. I mean, the dollar is really something that has value because we think it has value. But again, it's just faith in the central bank and faith in the U.S. government that gives the dollar its value. And because everyone sort of agrees it has value, then it has some. But what we're seeing, I think one of the things Jim worries about is it won't always be the Coca-Cola of currencies. That at some point, if we continue on the path that we're on, people will lose that faith. It's happened to many other currencies around the world. It's happening right now in places like Venezuela and Argentina, where their currency is losing value very rapidly. And so it's a big concern that we have this brand, but as the United States, our dollar is the world reserve currency, but are we managing it properly? That's the big question.
How did you get so many former Fed officials, including Paul Volcker and many others, on camera?
It wasn't easy. It took us quite a while to get the permission that we got to interview, as you mentioned, Paul Volcker, who's a former chairman Janet Yellen, who's now the new chair of the Fed, and many other, over a dozen current and former Fed officials. You know, I think one of the things that you can say about the Fed that's a good thing is that it's open to criticism, and I think they're open to debate about Fed policies in general. So a lot of senior Fed officials are actually not too happy with policies in recent years, and they were willing to go on camera and to speak critically about the role the Fed played, both in helping to create the crisis and in the policies it's taken up after the crisis.
So many former Federal Reserve officials and economists on camera talking to you say that the Federal Reserve itself caused the housing collapse of 2008. How was that?
Yeah, I mean, what we go through in detail in the film, I can explain briefly, is that by lowering interest rates in 2001 and 2 and 3 very aggressively to historic lows and holding them there, in the midst of what was already sort of a housing bubble in 2001 and 2, the Fed basically caused the bubble to get much bigger than it might have otherwise had the Fed been acting, I would argue, more responsibly. So basically the Fed was encouraging, with low interest rates, home buyers to take on more risk, to take on bigger mortgages. They were encouraging banks to lend more and to lever themselves more by the banks themselves. Big investment banks like Lehman Brothers borrowed lots of money in that period. And they were also encouraging investors around the world by lowering interest rates. Investors were seeking a yield. They were seeking a higher return. So it encouraged actually investors to buy subprime mortgage-backed securities, the things that later were called toxic mortgages. You know, people were encouraged to buy those in 2004 and 2005 because of the low interest rates that the Fed helped to create.
The Federal Reserve and its role in the creation of and the sustaining of policies at one time thought to be no part of its original mission is just one small part of the many questions and concerns people have about the Fed. What are your thoughts on some of those policies, if any, at this time?
The policies today, I mean, I think the big question is we had a crisis. The Fed policies in many ways helped lead to that crisis. And now to respond to the collapse of the housing bubble, the Fed has, generated lower interest rates even than before, and is once again encouraging people to borrow more, encouraging banks to lend more. Banks and homeowners are actually not taking them up on the offer by and large, so we're not seeing a huge bubble yet in the housing market. But you are seeing people do foolish things, for example, in the stock market. So the Fed is really creating all the incentives that led to the crisis in 2008. They're creating those incentives again. They're holding them in place for a long period of time again. And I worry that once again we're going to see prices of things like stock and houses fall as these Fed policies are unwound, or as people simply are unable to pay the prices that the Fed has sort of artificially raised.
Monday, February 3rd, just a few days ago since this show, the Federal Reserve swore in its first female head, Janet Yellen, succeeding Ben Bernanke. Now, you spent time talking to Yellen. Do you see or perceive any changes in her approach that could be a sea change in the regulations and policies of the Fed at this time?
My big concern is that I don't expect a big change from Ben Bernanke to Janet Yellen's tenure. I think she's been at the Fed over the course of the last 15 years on and off, and I think she really sort of embodies the status quo, the same types of thinking that got us into the crisis. So I really don't expect different policies. I wish she would be rethinking some of the strategies the Fed's taken on. They do seem to be rethinking quantitative easing, which has been their policy really for the last 5 years. They seem intent on tapering that, removing that policy. But I think it's too late. I think quantitative easing has created problems that Janet Yellen is going to be stuck with, and the U.S. economy and financial system may be stuck with for the next couple of years.
The Fed, since its creation, has never been more powerful, its policies more immediate in their effects upon global business and governments, and of course, their citizens. As we discuss current financial crises that appear to be caused by or greatly exasperated by Federal Reserve policies, I wanted to ask your opinion on some historical points. Some say the Federal Reserve actually created and even military decisions of the U.S. Jim, in your opinion, did the Federal Reserve play a role in facilitating World War I, and what could be the motive behind such a plan if it did?
You know, I'm not that much of an expert on World War I, but I can say that central banks, and the Fed is no exception, are always called upon during wars by governments to finance the war. And if you think about it, basically wars cost a lot of money. All of a sudden you have to get a lot of guns and a lot of uniforms and a lot of, you know, oil and tanks and all the things that go into fighting a war. You know, when a war begins suddenly, those cost a lot of money. They cost the government a lot of money. So central banks in World War I and World War II were no exception. Central banks are always called upon by governments to fund those wars. If you think about it, if a government, you know, went and told the people, we're thinking about a war, but we have to pay for it, so we're going to raise taxes, you know, the average person would probably vote against that. So what governments do in wartime is rely on central banks to create currency. Usually it causes a big inflation. We talk about that in the film in the case of the Vietnam War, but World War I and World War II were no exception. There was inflation. The central bank, the Fed in this case, held interest rates lower than they would have been otherwise to help fund the war, help the government borrow the money that it needed for the war. So that's an interesting fact about central banks. They're always called upon in wartime. It's very hard to fight a war if all of a sudden you have to come up with the funding for that war. So central banks are used for that.
Yeah, real time's a little expensive, I hear.
Yeah.
The League of Nations was created after World War I, and the Federal Reserve was created the year before. Do you believe there was any link between the two events, and if so, could the Fed be interested in seeing the League of Nations formed for that purpose?
You know, again, this is an area I'm not too familiar with the League of Nations, but I don't think there's necessarily a connection specifically. But I do think it is part of, you know, the creation of the Fed around the time of World War I, and the creation of things like the UN and the League of Nations, you know, is part of a centralization of sort of, you know, power and decision making. That's sort of a trend that's been in place for years now. You know, the U.S. was not always so reliant on centralized power, and things like the League of Nations didn't always exist. So I think it's part of a greater trend. I don't know that the Fed itself, Fed officials, were particularly connected with the League of Nations, because I feel like that's foreign policy. But you know, to some degree, it's all part of a process we're on in evolving how we govern our system.
The film Money for Nothing really does a really great job, I feel, for most of us of really reviewing the history of the Federal Reserve and our history. In that light, was the Federal Reserve, in your mind, active in actually creating the circumstances of the Great Depression?
You know, we go into that in the film. I think, you know, Ben Bernanke himself has acknowledged that the Fed played a major role in creating the Great Depression and making it as bad as it was. And it's sort of the view generally of economists that if the Fed had been smarter about its policies after the 1929 stock crash in particular, the banking panic that really made the Great Depression what it was, that crippled our economy, saw the economy, I think, cut down by a third, which was much larger than our most recent crisis, was really a product of the Fed not realizing that we were in a banking panic, not reacting properly to it, not serving the role that it had been created for. Ironically, the Fed was created to prevent banking panics. You know, 20 years into its existence, we had the biggest one in our history, and the Fed really did not respond to it. The other thing we point out in the film is that part of the problem of the Great Depression was also the imbalances that grew up in the 1920s. So we look at Fed policy, which was easier than it might have otherwise been in the 1920s, easy money once again, helping to spur stock and debt bubbles in the U.S. and that you know, that it wasn't just the crisis that happened afterwards. It was also the, you know, these sort of bubbles that came before it that the Fed was, you know, was indeed playing a role in.
In your opinion, Jim, what part was the lessening? Could the lessening of civil and certain business rights during the Great Depression play in strengthening the power or the centralization of the Federal Reserve? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I don't think, you know, different laws that were passed, I don't think had to do with what the Fed was lobbying for, but I think the Great Depression created the New Deal. It created a different perspective on the role of governments in the economy. The U.S. government has been much more involved in our economy after the Great Depression than they were beforehand. And you could say after the creation of the Fed than they were beforehand. So I think it's part of this overall trend of more and more sort of centralized power, some would say central planning, coming out of places in Washington, one of the major places being the Federal Reserve. And if you look at the Fed today, when the Fed was created, I don't think no one then could have imagined the role the Fed is playing right now. And it's the biggest influence in the U.S. government debt market, which is the largest market in the world. It's the biggest influence on the stock market. It's also the biggest influence right now in the housing market because they're buying $500 billion of mortgages each year, and they're continuing to do that. So I think that's what the part of the story we tell is this ever-expanding role of the Fed and the sort of central planners in our economy. And the big question is, are they doing the right things, or are they actually making things worse?
What is your understanding of the possibility of a one world order elite out there? And would the actions of the Federal Reserve in its history point to this kind of endgame by the Federal Reserve itself?
I mean, you know, a lot of people associate the Fed with again, this trend towards more and more centralized power. I think Fed officials like Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke, I don't think they necessarily have an agenda in terms of, you know, personally wanting to support different political groups or a certain agenda in terms of international politics. But I think one way to think about it is that our system really wouldn't have survived the crisis of 2008 without massive central bank intervention, without the Fed's support and protection, which still remains in place today. And I think the big question is, do we want a system that can only work with massive assistance, that can only sort of survive with massive assistance from central banks and governments, or do we want the kind of economy and financial system that we might have had in decades or even centuries earlier, where it wasn't reliant on this sort of central control and central support and really money printing at the central bank level and massive borrowing at the federal government level?
I'm speaking with Jim Bruce, producer and director of Money for Nothing Inside the Federal Reserve. I remind you of their great website, moneyfornothingthemovie.org. Go and check it out for yourself. You can order the DVD there and so on. In Money for Nothing, you show Ben Bernanke saying in 2010, the myth is we are printing money. We're not printing money. And then right after that, 2009, he's quoted as saying when discussing the TARP funding, is that tax money we're borrowing? No tax money. It's much more like printing money than borrowing. What do you do with these mixed messages?
You know, I think the Fed, and a lot of times, is their own worst enemy in the sense that it's confusing enough what they do, and sometimes, you know, people like Chairman Bernanke have given very mixed signals about, you know, and describing Fed policy. So that contradiction is a bit ridiculous. I mean, at different times, the Fed has been simply printing money or doing it in a modified way. But really, any way you slice it, what the Fed has been doing since the financial crisis has been, you know, printing more dollars to try to make the prices of things go up, because they view the problem as you know, falling prices in houses or stocks, for example. But if you look at the world we're living in today, you know, by any measure, housing is not underpriced. There's very few places where people, you know, houses are just too cheap in their neighborhood. Usually it's the opposite problem. So if you look, when we look at Fed history, oftentimes, you know, they've been on the wrong track, and we argue in the film they remain on the wrong track today. They're trying to fix our problems in a way that's actually creating bigger problems.
Now, I know your budget was tight. How did you get Liev Schreiber to be the voice of Money for Nothing?
It wasn't easy to get, you know, and just as a note, Liev is one of the most talented actors out there working today. And as a narrator, he's absolutely brilliant and did a brilliant job on the film. We actually, to get in touch with Liev, we had to, it's sort of a typical Hollywood story, you have to know somebody. So our co-producer, her childhood babysitter, actually had dated Liev Schreiber and was still friends with him. So through that connection, we were able to get in touch with him via email, and then and then go down the road to actually getting him to sign on to the project.
What do you hope the public gains from seeing Money for Nothing, Jim?
You know, I think the goal of the film is really to give people a context for understanding what we've just been through, and for seeing that the central bank for the last 100 years has been having an impact on their lives, and that right now the Fed is having more of an impact than they ever have before on our financial system. And so what we hope to do is we hope people will come away from the film realizing that they have a stake in central bank policy, and that it's going to affect them and their lives and their children's lives. And you know, one of the things we hope will happen is that if more people are aware of what the Fed is doing, there'll be more accountability, and ultimately there'll be some reform. That if the American people realize that to some extent these crises we're living through have been created by our central bank, they might say, you know, they might send a message to the Fed either through Congress, you know, changing the laws that govern the Federal Reserve, or simply through the court of public opinion, sending a message saying, hey, you know, enough with these bubbles. Let's have a financial system that's stable. Let's have a currency and a banking system that we know will last for 100 years, that we can pass on to our children and grandchildren. Whereas I don't think people feel like they've had much of a choice. I think what they've seen in the wake of the crisis is Ben Bernanke saying, I have to do these things. Don't worry too much about what I'm doing. I'm on top of it. I know what I'm doing. You know, trust me, and everything will get better. And you know, I think that's the message people have heard. And I'm worried that they're going to be. That's what people felt about Alan Greenspan. They felt like Alan Greenspan in the '90s and the 2000s. They thought he was, you know, he's going to make everybody in America, you know, rich with stocks or housing. And I think we saw that, you know, in the end, that was kind of a mirage. And I'm worried that the same thing will happen with this current boom. So the goal of the film is really to create awareness of the central bank, to get people talking about it, thinking about it in schools and universities, and really, you know, in Congress and in political circles, to think about how we might change or reform our central bank.
Now, I know you really have a great willingness, for your passion for this, to get the film out and screen it for people. Are you also, do I remember correctly, Jim, you were willing to actually go for the right group, the right audience, to be there to screen it? Or, you know, how are you making access to the film besides at moneyfornothingthefilm.org?
Yeah, you know, besides our website where people can simply buy a DVD, we are also screening the film in theaters really around the world, actually. We're opening in Canada in late February, in Toronto, in theaters there. But, you know, I've traveled really for the last 4 or 5 months. I've been traveling to cities, in some cases film festivals around the world, but also cities around the country to do screenings with financial offices, with local financial societies, with political groups, with universities. So we're really trying to get the film seen by as many people as possible. And one of the things the film does is raise a lot of questions. So it's been a lot of fun for me to go and take questions afterwards, sometimes with local figures or professors, and to really discuss the issues in the film. So we really ask people to reach out to us if they feel like they might like to have a screening in their community. We make it very easy and very affordable. I also have done some Skype Q&As. We even had a screening with the Dutch Central Bank because some of their officials had seen the film at a festival in Amsterdam. So we really are trying to open up discussion. You know, one of the things about the Fed is it's viewed as very complex, and to some degree that discourages people from discussing it because people feel like they're not qualified. But you know, I think one of the things I've learned is you don't need a PhD to understand the arguments surrounding Fed policy. It really is a question of judgment and human nature, much more than any kind of complex economics or math.
Well, I felt so empowered after watching the film to say, seriously, you guys didn't, wait a minute, okay, fool me once. Are you kidding? Finally, are you staying on top of the story as far as thoughts for more work around the Federal Reserve, maybe in a few years, to do a checkup on it, part 2?
I mean, I really hope that we put ourselves on a better path and there isn't a need for a sequel. You know, and that in the next few years we do see a different perspective taking shape with leaders at the Fed, and they're steering towards the direction of focusing much more on financial stability and preserving the value of the currency than right now, where they're focused on creating inflation, and they're talking about pushing up stock and housing prices again, which we've seen in the past hasn't worked out too well. So I hope there's not a need for a sequel, but I feel like to the extent the Fed does create more problems, I may have to get my camera out again.
Call the crew back. Right. The producer and director of the documentary Money for Nothing Inside the Federal Reserve. Find out much more at the website, moneyfornothingthemovie.org. Thanks for joining me, Jim Bruce. Great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.